over these years with two completely different sets of laws applicable to banks which compete with each other for the same customers and issue the same products, right? And we have them operate under two different laws. So again, we must come to the conclusion that the only way in which this can be reversed is to repeal the Bank Nationalization Acts and to distance the banks in their governance functions from the government, which means move over those governance powers to what we said should be a holding company, and eventually from that holding company to the boards of the individual banks. In the case of private sector banks, boards are supreme. They control everything. All the strategic decisions that need to be taken are taken by those boards. In the case of public sector banks, all the strategic decisions are laid down for them by the government under the Bank Nationalization Act, which empowers them to do so. So if you want to reverse this, you have to reverse a sequence of laws which have been passed in the past, and you have to essentially unwind that legal system and make it exactly on par with what applies to private sector banks. So think of what damage this does, homogenization, right? A word that I used earlier. If you homogenize the banks, there's no way on strategic issues the banks can compete, right? Because you have prevented them from differentiating themselves. And the essence of getting competitive advantage is differentiation. And you have prevented this in the case of public sector banks. If all the critical issues are to be pre-decided by the government of India, it didn't matter in the days when you didn't have private sector banks. But in this competition with private sector banks, it is impossible essentially to think of a way in which they can be competitive. I remember talking to one of these, again, retired chairmen, and again, I've met people who say you can't actually believe what retired chairmen of banks tell you. They're discredited only because they've been chairman of public sector banks. So there's a snobbish view in other circles which actually talks about it. But you don't have to believe them, right, if you don't want to. But the very fact that they believe it and it affects the way in which conduct and behavior of these banks as a consequence unfolds means that it has real effects, right? It actually affects the way in which the bank is able to compete. So I asked one of these retired chairmen, I said, what is it that makes for a good chairman of a public sector bank? And he said, he must have a spine. He must look over his shoulder and he must prevent abuse of authority. So I said, what about seeking long-term competitive advantage? What about business strategy? And he looked at me and he said, I know that's important for private sector banks, but it's a generation away for public sector banks, right? I think this is a dismal indictment of the role of what a chairman should do. But if I were in his place, I'd probably end up doing the same, because if there's abuse of authority, you have to prevent it before you can creatively begin looking at what can constructively be done within that bank. And my third and final theme is that of a level playing field. I've alluded to this earlier, but there's so many ways in which the public sector bankers suffer vis-a-vis the private sector banks. Let's just count the ways in which the government of India does not love its own banks, right? We've talked about dual regulation. You can't have a situation where you have a different set of regulatory requirements for public sector banks and you don't have it for private sector banks. Human resources. One of the reasons why private sector banks are able to get a lot of very good specialist talent is because they can organize human resources to recruit such people. You can't do that because senior level human resources policy is laid down. It's parameterized for the public sector banks. Compensation. This has been under the bonnet as far as the public sector generally is concerned, right? And there has to be parity with civil service pay and all the rest of it, right? And all that is a huge deterrent when in the private sector salaries have been rising to find that you can't pay comparable salaries. In the report of the committee that I chaired, we actually gave some data on the wide disparity, and it's actually shocking. The CEO of a public sector bank, on an average, earns about 18 lakhs a year. The CEO of a private sector bank earns an average of, I think it was something like 3.5 crores a year, and in addition gets stock options, right, which can be worth a multiple of that. Now, under such circumstances, to expect behavior to be identical when the incentivization systems are so different is to live in an illusory world. And something has to give way at some stage, right? We have to, I think, now unbottle the genie of compensation, right, in a way which would make it possible for the public sector to succeed. Public sector banks have done this elsewhere. Singapore is a very good example, where DBS is a public sector bank and is completely in control of all these strategic decisions, right? When the present CEO of the bank was appointed, there was a search committee set up by the bank. It was not set up by the owners of the bank, which is Temasek. It was not set up by the owners of Temasek, which is the government of Singapore. It was set up by the bank. But over here in India, right, it's the government that sets up a committee. And as one of the former chairmen told me, they airdrop directors onto our boards, right? They suddenly end up on our boards and we really don't know anything about them. We don't do a due diligence on them. We don't have to figure out whether they provide the right kind of skills. They just airdropped onto the boards of our banks. So we were talking about the absence of level playing field, and I've listed a few of them. Vigilance enforcement from outside, right? We've talked a little about the damage that does, and it's essentially because of the way in which the vigilance process operates within banks. I was actually myself surprised when I found that in practice what happens is that if any loan of more than 1 crore, that's 10 million, is given, 10 million rupees is given, and it becomes a non-performing asset, it is subject to vigilance scrutiny. 1 crore, right? And what vigilance looks at, very simply, whether procedures have been violated. If any procedures have been violated, right, then a potential vigilance case is initiated. Now, I just want to make 2 comments on this. Firstly, I think the burden of evidence has to be stronger. You really need to ask whether there's been self-benefit, monetary or otherwise, to the person who took these decisions. A pure procedural violation cannot be the basis of proceeding in vigilance matters. And secondly, this sanctity of procedure is really very strange. In the private sector banks, some of the most innovative loans which have been given because procedures need to be violated. Remember that credit is a relationship, a paired relationship between borrower and lender. It's specific to the borrower and lender. You can't think in terms of generalizing it across all borrowers and lenders. That's the essence of a credit relationship. And if a credit relationship is done in an honest and an intelligent way, errors will occur, right? But the really good credit relationships are those which look innovatively, not at earlier ways of lending, but at new ways of lending. You can't do this in a public sector bank. One of the reasons why public sector banks have such large exposures to electricity boards is because it cannot be subject to vigilance scrutiny. You're lending to the public sector. So think of how incentives have now got perverse, where you lend to state electricity boards, right, essentially because there can't be vigilance enforcement. And we know the mess that this has created in recent years. So I think we need a burden of evidence which is higher, which is stronger. We need the vigilance authorities to do a significantly more difficult job of actually being able to demonstrate that there has been personal self-benefit. And if you leave it the way it is today, what tends to happen is that you're clubbing together the genuinely dishonest with those who have violated process, violated procedure, right? Eventually, you get to a stage where you really do not know who is honest and who is dishonest because you've clubbed the two together, right? Neither the outside world nor the bank itself is really in a position to say that this has been targeting the right people. In the words of statisticians, you have both a type 1 error and a type 2 error. Those who should be included are excluded, and those who should be excluded are included. And I think we need a vigilance mechanism which reduces both kinds of errors, and you don't get that today. So you do a great deal of damage, and this actually affects the narratives of bankers in terms of the ecosystem that they face much more strongly. So I'm now going to pull the various threads of my argument together, because I think I've talked a lot about the narrative of bankers, and as I've said on many occasions, you don't have to believe them, but it affects the way the conduct of the bank is done. And I just want to make the following point. Firstly, I think there's a lot to be said for the view that if the government banks are to be saved, they have to be saved against the government. If you're a civil servant sitting in the finance ministry, and I used to sit at one stage in the finance ministry myself, right? You find it very difficult, if you believe you're professional, to believe that you are the source of this wider ecosystem corruption that is occurring. And I use the corruption not in a monetary sense, but in the sense of the disintegration of the wider ecosystem that's occurring. You find it very difficult to believe it. And that's because you have no control over the ecosystem. You could be sitting in Gosplan as the head of Gosplan and not knowing what's happening to the rest of Soviet Russia, right? It is that kind of a whole series of changes occurring in the ecosystem that you really have no ability to control. And I think reform will occur in India when civil servants have the conviction and politicians have the resolve to ensure that there's this distancing between the government and the banks. Anything which is short of that will really not succeed in changing the conditions under which banks operate. And until that political resolve and civil service conviction arises, I don't believe that there's going to be any significant reform in the banking system. I want to end with, as I believe a lot of the people over here at the conference are economists, I want to end with a quote from Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. Now, Adam Smith was a bitter critic, as you would all know, of the East India Company. And he was a bitter critic because the East India Company had a monopoly charter to trade in India, right? And Adam Smith, as you know, didn't like monopoly charter and believed that, the market should be open. But he also criticized the East India Company for the way in which the Court of Proprietors, which is what in those days was referred to as the Board of Directors, right? The Court of Proprietors, the way they handled the East India Company. And this is the quote: "Frequently, a man of great fortune, sometimes even a man of small fortune, is willing to purchase a £1,000 share in India stock merely for the influence which he expects to acquire in the Court of Proprietors. It gives him a share, though not in the plunder, yet in the appointment of the plunderers of India. Provided he can enjoy the influence for a few years and thereby provide for a certain number of his friends, he cares little about the dividend or even the value of the stock upon which his vote is founded." This was almost 250 years ago. If we want the experience of India's public sector banks to be very different, then I think it's time that we moved ahead. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to answer any questions.
Yeah, would you prefer to stand there?
Whichever. I can stand here.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes for questions. I'll open it up to the floor. Would anybody like to? Yeah.
My name is Kalpana Kochar from the IMF. So how would you, against what you said, evaluate the Indra Dhanush and other reforms that have just been announced?
Well, I think they're inadequate. I think reform will begin when we decide to roll back the laws. And I don't think there's been any announcement that the laws are going to be rolled back. This means that, the law of bank nationalization has to be rolled back. I don't think it's necessary to privatize the Indian banks, though I think it would be desirable to do it. I don't think it's necessary to privatize these banks, but it would be greatly helpful if the government share in these banks came down to less than 50%, because a lot of the unlevel playing field would immediately disappear. The reason why there are all these constraints on the public sector banks is because they're part of the state. And if you're part of the state, then there are a separate set of constraints which apply. The moment you make them minority held by the government of India, they're no longer part of the state, the government of India would continue to be equally dominant in shareholder meetings. If you had a 45% stake, they would continue to feel that they could manage these banks, right, with a 45% stake. But these banks would then not suffer from the unlevel playing field that they do today. So in the report of this committee, we have actually suggested that that's a very easy way of removing these constraints. But the law has to be changed significantly for all this to happen. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. The gentleman on the left there. Yeah, here.
Sir, some of the banks or private banks are indulging in money laundering. Do you think it's a violation of ethics or a part of business?
No, if they're indulging in money laundering, of course, it's a violation of ethics. And the idea is not to say that there's virtue in private sector banks. The idea is to say that we have created constraints on public sector banks which do not permit them to compete on level terms, right? I think, governance is a major issue also in some of the private sector banks. If you read the report of the committee again, you will find that we have 2 chapters on governance issues in private sector banks, but that was not the theme of today's talk. Maybe that requires a second talk at some stage.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
I have a question. Yeah. Do you think that markets can, create pressure of changes and reform, which government has been hesitant to do? Look at the shares of private PSU banks, and versus the private sector banks. The smallest private sector bank today may be, extremely more valuable than one of the bigger PSU banks. And they can't raise capital. The government has fiscal constraints. They can't recapitalize them, etc. So what in the normal course one expected out of probably your report, and good sense prevailing from the government, maybe markets could, force them to do that. What's your reaction to that?
Well, when controlling shareholders decide that minority shareholders really don't matter, what minority shareholders tend to do is to vote with their feet and walk away, right? And that is what has happened, which is why the prices of the shares of public sector banks have fallen. Again, there's this great difficulty when you have a listed public sector bank to think of these as government banks, because there are these delicate issues of how do you handle minority shareholder interests, right? And I've really not seen too much sensitivity to this in the way in which the government has responded. Remember that all shareholders, including minority shareholders, elect directors to represent them as their custodians to make sure that shareholder interests are protected, right? But if these directors are disempowered because all the important decisions in boards have been taken by the government of India, then you're actually shortchanging minority shareholders, because they participate in shareholders meetings in order to put a board together to run the bank. And these boards can't run the bank because strategic decisions have already been taken outside. So I think there's a certain difficulty in thinking of government banks, right, which are listed and therefore have minority shareholders. What is even more ironical in the case of Indian banks is that government has shortchanged the very banks that it has put capital in, right? I can't think of a private sector investor ever doing that. And one should actually quote the example of what the UK did, because when these 2 banks, RBS and Lloyds, got troubled and they were taken over by the government created this holding company to manage them. And they had an agreement between the holding company and the government which had essentially 3 paras in it. And one of the paras was that nothing would be done in the holding company to benefit these 2 banks which had been taken over, so that competition is maintained in the market. In India, on the other hand, we bend over backwards not to benefit public sector banks. And really, we've handed over competitiveness to the private sector banks on a platter as a consequence. Right? So I would say that we've actually moved in a completely different direction. Right? And we've shortchanged, as I said, the very banks that we have put capital in from the government.
Yeah. Tom? Here, in front, over here.
Sorry, quick one. I'm Tom Richardson from the IMF also. You spoke eloquently about the problems of chartered accountants who are also members of the boards of public sector banks, and the challenges that kind of that has given rise to, and also probably other problems that arise when their helicopter dropped onto the board. In most countries, and I think also in India, the central bank as the regulator and supervisor of the banks is meant to ensure that senior officials of banks, including members of the boards, meet some standard of fit and proper qualifications, right, to ensure that they haven't engaged in any improper behavior in the past. Are you worried that that's not effectively possible for PSU banks? Is the RBI unable to kind of enforce that part of its mandate for these banks?
Absolutely, because in the private sector bank, before you bring in a director, and typically what happens is the nominations committee would begin identifying potential directors. They would talk to the CEO. The CEO himself might have a couple of names, and eventually they would try and interest these people to come in, and there would be a thorough due diligence which would need to be done. In the case of a public sector bank director, you can't do a due diligence in the bank because it's been nominated by the government. There's been an announcement saying that the following person is airdropped onto your bank. And therefore, you don't go through a process of doing a due diligence, right, because the person has already been selected. So the logic of selection is altogether different. And even for civil servants who finally decide to nominate these people, you don't know where the names have come from. Right? A civil servant sitting in the finance ministry would have suggestions emanating from different parts of the government. We don't know what route it has taken, how it has actually eventually come, right? But these names suddenly land up on the desks of civil servants, and they're told that do consider these people for nomination to banks, right? It's an altogether unsatisfactory process in the way that you just recognized.
Okay, take gentleman in the back. Yes, Mr. Mehta.
Yes, I think during this last 20 years, the reform process, the Indian banking industry has been treated as the best industry. Okay, and now in terms of the transparency, also when the capital adequacy ratio is around 15 to 17%, and CRIER loss. The point you have made that on the one hand, the banking industry is going towards transparency, but on the other hand, you